My wife is bending over backward to salvage the marriage she shattered by being unfaithful. She had an affair and even had a child with another man. Your Honor, my client wishes to avoid divorce and respectfully requests the court to mandate counseling, her lawyer pleaded. She believes the marriage can be repaired with a bit of guidance. That was her attorney speaking on behalf of Julie, my soon-to-be ex-wife. If I had anything to say about it, though, it would be a different story. My client has endured a year-long affair involving multiple partners, culminating in a child that DNA tests confirm is not his, my lawyer countered as he stood. This is far beyond a minor issue, and there is no merit in prolonging this charade of a marriage. Counseling will not resolve anything. The judge, however, seemed unconvinced. It's precisely because of the child that I'm inclined to require counseling. A child deserves to grow up in a stable environment. I couldn't hold my tongue. If you think I'm going to raise that cheating woman's kid, I barked, only to be interrupted by the judge slamming his gavel. One more word, Mr. Stedman, and I'll hold you in contempt, he thundered. I'm ordering 1 month of counseling, 2 sessions per week. Attend, or face the consequences. He fixed me with a sharp glare before banging the gavel again. Julie, ever smug, shot me a self-satisfied smirk as I walked into the counselor's office for the first session. I'm Dr. Sullivan, but feel free to call me Gerald, the man said warmly. May I call you Brian? No, you may not. Address me as Mr. Stedman, I replied curtly. Brian, there's no need, Julie began, but I cut her off immediately. And you don't speak to me. At all. Let's all take a moment to calm down, Dr. Sullivan interjected. Mr. Stedman, please have a seat. He gestured toward one of the 2 chairs in front of his desk. I dragged my chair several feet away from Julie before sitting down. Gar. Sullivan sighed audibly. All right, he began, but I didn't hear much of what followed. I slipped my AirPods in and started playing music on my phone, tuning him out entirely. He exchanged words with Julie, but I wasn't paying attention. 15 minutes later, she shot up from her chair, gave me a seething look, and stormed out of the room. I finally removed my earbuds. Well, Doc, fantastic session. See you Thursday. I'm canceling the sessions and submitting my report to the judge, he replied with a tone of finality. Even better, I said as I left his office. In court, the judge was less than amused. Give me one good reason why I shouldn't hold your client in contempt, he demanded, glaring at my attorney. Your Honor, the order required my client to attend the sessions, which he did, my lawyer argued. It was the counselor who decided to terminate the remaining appointments. The judge shot back, the report clearly states your client refused to engage and spent the session ignoring everyone with headphones on. My client complied with the attendance requirement, my lawyer pressed. Since the counselor deemed further sessions futile, we request that you grant the divorce as filed. Absolutely not, the judge snapped. I'm ordering an additional 4 weeks of counseling. Mr. Stedman will not only attend but fully participate this time. When I arrived for the next session, the room looked exactly as it had before, 2 chairs positioned a foot apart in front of the doctor's desk. The desk itself held nothing but a yellow legal pad and a framed photo of a woman in her mid-30s with a child who seemed about 6. Mr. Stedman, the doctor said as I walked in, please take a seat. Once again, I began dragging my chair farther away. Julie reached out, and I flinched away. Let me be clear, I said firmly, any physical contact will be considered an attack, and I will respond accordingly. Julie gasped, recoiling her hand. I continued moving the chair and sat down. Dr. Sullivan spoke up again, his tone more resolute this time. Mr. Stedman, the judge has ordered you to actively participate in this session. The doctor gave me a pointed reminder. Mr. Stedman, you're required to engage in these sessions. I'm aware, I replied coolly. I'm using my phone to record the session as proof of my participation. My lawyer warned me that some counselors might have their own agendas. Considering my soon-to-be ex-wife has been seeing you for a while now, I can't help but wonder if you've already formed a bias in her favor. Dr. Sullivan leaned back slightly. And what if I don't consent to being recorded? He asked. Then I'll file a motion to request a different counselor, I stated bluntly. I have every right to do so. The only reason I haven't taken that route yet is because I'm trying to avoid further delays. Julie, how do you feel about the session being recorded? The doctor asked, turning to her. Whatever, she muttered with a dismissive wave of her hand. Can we just get this over with? All right, Dr. Sullivan said, exhaling audibly. To begin. Before we start, may I ask a question? I interrupted. Of course, he replied, though his weary expression revealed just how little faith he had in this process. Julie, however, sat with that smug look plastered across her face, the same one she always wore when she thought she had the upper hand. She genuinely believed that this entire charade would somehow force me to back down, to stay in this broken marriage. But she was mistaken. She always was. She never truly understood me or what I wanted. I watched as Dr. Sullivan adjusted his notepad on the desk, preparing to launch into what felt like a routine script. He began with the usual therapist rhetoric, urging us to let go of past grievances and focus on rebuilding trust. He spoke about the importance of mutual effort and starting fresh. But I wasn't listening. My thoughts drifted to all the lies, the countless betrayals, and worst of all, her sheer audacity. For an entire year, she deceived me, living a double life, and yet here she sat, acting as if I were the one standing in the way of reconciliation. Dr. Sullivan's voice snapped me back to the present when he addressed me directly. Brian, how do you feel about all this? For a moment, I considered unleashing everything, the anger, the heartbreak, the humiliation, but what would be the point? They wouldn't understand. Julie certainly wouldn't. She leaned forward with that insincere, pitying look, as though she actually cared about my response. Honestly, I began, my voice steady but laced with raw emotion. I feel betrayed. I feel like a fool, a man who gave his all to someone who didn't respect or value him. My wife led a double life, and now we're sitting here, pretending there's something left to salvage when, in reality, it's already gone. Julie opened her mouth, likely to defend herself, but Dr. Sullivan raised his hand, stopping her. Please, continue, he urged me. It was rare to have the floor without her interruptions, so I pressed on. The truth, Dr. Sullivan, is that this marriage is dead. It died the moment she decided I wasn't enough, that the love, loyalty, and trust one gave her weren't enough. And now, after everything, she wants to save this marriage? For what? So I can sit beside her every day, reminded of the child she had with someone else? The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, thick with tension. Dr. Sullivan, ever the professional, tried to ease it by shifting the conversation toward forgiveness. Sometimes, he began, it takes an act of true love to rebuild what's been broken. That was enough to make me laugh, a cold and humorless sound. True love? I scoffed. With all due respect, doctor, I know what true love is. True love is what kept me faithful to this woman. It's what made me overlook her flaws and dedicate myself to our marriage. But this? This isn't love. This is betrayal. It's a complete mockery of what a marriage should stand for. Julie's composure finally cracked, and she began to cry softly, her sobs breaking the heavy silence. I felt nothing but cold detachment. She could cry all she wanted, but no amount of tears would undo what she had done. After a few moments, she gathered herself and, with a trembling voice, began to speak. I made a mistake, Brian. A terrible mistake. But that doesn't erase everything we've been through, the life we built together. We have a history, a life worth fighting for. The sheer hypocrisy of her words almost made me walk out of the room right then and there. Worth fighting for? Did she honestly believe that? I took a slow, deep breath, struggling to keep my composure. When I finally spoke, my voice was devoid of any warmth. You had a whole year to think about that, Julie. And every single time you lied to me, every time you met with him, you made a choice. This wasn't a mistake, it was a decision you made over and over again. And now you want me to just forget? Pretend it never happened? Sorry, but the love I had for you died the moment I found out the truth. Dr. Sullivan tried, and failed, to de-escalate the tension. He urged us to focus on finding a way forward, something that would help us both move on without bitterness. But how could I let go of resentment when the very person who was supposed to have my back was the one who betrayed me first? Eventually, he suggested we sit in silence and reflect. Julie started crying harder, her sobs echoing through the room, but I ignored her completely. To me, those tears were just part of her well-practiced performance. After a few minutes of awkward silence, Dr. Sullivan ended the session. He asked us to return next week, hopefully with a more constructive mindset. We left the room without a word, but just as I was about to leave the building, Julie called out to me. "I know you hate me now," she said, her voice shaking. "But I swear, I can make this right. Just give me a chance." I turned to look at her and, for the first time, saw someone entirely different from the woman I once loved. She was only now realizing what she had lost, but it was far too late. All I could feel was overwhelming indifference. "It's not hate, Julie," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I just don't care anymore." Her face crumpled, and she stepped back as if I had physically struck her. I turned away and walked out the door, feeling an unexpected sense of liberation. For months, I had been trapped in the hell of this marriage, but for the first time, it felt like I was finally free. That night, I lay in the small apartment I had rented after moving out of our house. The emptiness around me was suffocating, but it carried a strange sense of clarity. Amid the silence, a bitter purpose began to take shape. After all the lies, humiliation, and those pointless therapy sessions, I realized that this ordeal would likely never end the way I hoped. Julie, always manipulative, always scheming, would keep fighting, not for love, but for control. She didn't want to save the marriage out of remorse. No, for her, it was all about convenience and maintaining appearances. That realization ignited a fire in me, an anger I couldn't shake. I couldn't bear the thought of stepping into another courtroom, listening to a judge drone on about reconciliation or the importance of giving the child a stable home. That child wasn't my responsibility. My lawyer had already warned me that Julie would turn this separation into a war. She'd accuse me of abandoning the family and use every tactic she could to twist the narrative. It was never about resolution for her, it was always about control. But if she thought she could keep pulling my strings, she was in for a rude awakening. The first thing I did was dig into every corner of her life I'd previously avoided. I went through her social media, sifted through her emails, and scoured old messages, searching for any slip-up, any skeleton she might have hidden. I even hired a private investigator, determined to uncover the truth no matter the cost. And just as I suspected, it didn't take long for something to surface. The private investigator came back with more than I had anticipated: photos, messages, and even bank records. It turned out Julie wasn't just involved with her so-called official lover. She had a whole network of flings and was spending an obscene amount of money on gifts and vacations for these men. The most shocking discovery? She had opened a joint bank account with one of them, transferring a significant portion of our savings into it. She must have thought I'd never catch on. With all this evidence in hand, I went straight to my lawyer. He was stunned by the sheer extent of what I had uncovered, but he urged caution. He reminded me that courts often view infidelity as irrelevant in divorce proceedings, and there was even a chance the evidence could be dismissed as an invasion of privacy. But I wasn't deterred. This wasn't about playing by their rules. It was about exposing the truth. I instructed him to file everything as evidence while I carefully planned my next steps. In the days that followed, I kept my distance from Julie. I acted as if I'd given up, sending polite, indifferent messages and maintaining a tone of resignation in our limited conversations. I knew she thought she had me where she wanted, that I was finally coming around, and would eventually comply with the court's demands for more counseling sessions. She even had the audacity to compliment me, calling me immature and reasonable for accepting the situation. It made my skin crawl, but I gritted my teeth and kept up the charade. I knew the moment I was waiting for would come soon enough. When the day of the final hearing arrived, I was ready. I sat quietly in court while Julie and her lawyer presented their case. They leaned heavily on a skewed counseling report, portraying me as resistant to reconciliation and painting her as the devoted spouse trying to heal the family. They argued that it was in the best interest of everyone, especially the child, that the court intervene and give the marriage another chance. As they spoke, I could barely contain my smirk. In a matter of minutes, their carefully constructed facade would collapse. When my lawyer stood up, he didn't waste a second. He presented every piece of evidence I had gathered, the bank transfers, the joint account, the photos of her with other men, and even the explicit messages she had exchanged with them. The courtroom grew tense as the evidence piled up. The judge sat in silence, visibly taken aback by the revelations. Julie, sitting beside me, turned as pale as a ghost. Her eyes darted nervously to her lawyer, who was frantically flipping through papers, searching for some kind of defense. But there was no defense. Piece by piece, the image of the repentant wife she had so carefully crafted crumbled before everyone's eyes. My lawyer finished his presentation with a strong argument. "Your Honor, this isn't just a case of infidelity. This is a deliberate and egregious violation of the marriage contract. Mrs. Stedman diverted significant marital assets to finance her double life. This is not a matter of healing, it is a matter of justice." The judge finally broke the silence, his tone firm. "There is no basis for reconciliation in this case," he declared. He ordered the divorce to be finalized immediately and ruled that Julie must repay the money she had taken from our account. Furthermore, she was legally prohibited from seeking any additional financial support from me in the future. Julie turned to me, her face filled with despair, as if hoping for a shred of compassion. But I felt none. All I felt was a cold, steady satisfaction. Justice had been served. Without a word, I stood, head held high, and walked out of the courtroom, leaving her behind to face the consequences of her choices. She was finally paying the price for everything she had done. In the months that followed, my life slowly started to return to normal. I managed to recover most of the stolen money and finalized the legal process, ensuring there was no room for Julie to contest any part of the settlement. Meanwhile, I heard rumors about her downfall. Without access to our shared assets, she had no means to cover her mounting expenses and was eventually evicted from her apartment. As for her so-called lovers, they disappeared the moment they realized she had nothing left to offer. Eventually, I learned through mutual acquaintances that Julie was living with distant relatives, barely scraping by. Her financial situation had grown dire. She tried reaching out to me several times, sending long, emotional messages full of apologies and promises that she had changed. She begged for a second chance, claiming she regretted everything and that we could still rebuild what we had. I didn't bother replying. I simply blocked every attempt she made to contact me. There was no anger left, no bitterness, only the clarity that this was the ending she had earned. And with that, I was finally free. Free from the lies, the betrayal, and the humiliation. Free to rebuild my life without the weight of the past dragging me down. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was able to look toward the future with hope. Julie and everything she represented were firmly behind me, exactly where they belonged.